Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories. Please like and subscribe, and hit that notification icon so you never miss out. Now on with the stories.
This isn't the kind of story I expected to share, but here it is. It all started when Karen moved into our quiet little neighborhood. At first, everything seemed normal. She'd wave from her porch, chat about the weather, typical new neighbor stuff. But man, did things change fast. It was a Tuesday morning when I first noticed something was off. I was out watering my petunias when I saw Karen marching down the street, clipboard in hand, eyes darting from house to house like she was on some kind of mission. I didn't think much of it at the time, but boy, was that the calm before the storm. Next thing I know, people are talking. Whispers at the mailbox, hushed conversations at the local coffee shop. Turns out, Karen had appointed herself as the unofficial rule enforcer of our HOA. Now, don't get me wrong, we all agreed to certain standards when we moved in, but this was something else entirely. I remember clear as day when she first came knocking on my door. There I was, enjoying my morning coffee, when I heard a sharp rap tap tap. I opened up, and there stood Karen, all 5'2" of her, with a scowl that could curdle milk. "Good morning, neighbor," she said, but her tone was anything but friendly. "I couldn't help but notice your grass is a quarter-inch too high. That'll be a $50 fine, payable to me directly." I nearly choked on my coffee. "Excuse me?" I spluttered. "Since when do you collect fines? And who decided my grass was too high?" She thrust a piece of paper at me. "I've taken the liberty of documenting all violations in the neighborhood. The HOA isn't doing their job, so someone has to step up." I took the paper, more out of shock than anything else. "Karen, this isn't how things work. You can't just..." But she was already turning on her heel, marching towards old Mrs. Johnson's house across the street. I watched, dumbfounded, as she repeated the process, leaving poor Mrs. Johnson looking as confused as I felt. Over the next few days, it was like livin' in some kinda twisted version of our neighborhood. Karen was everywhere, clipboard in hand, issuing fines left and right. Mr. Peterson got hit for having his trash cans out 5 minutes past the designated time. The Thompsons were cited for their kids' chalk drawings on the sidewalk. Even the Garcias, who'd just had a baby, weren't spared. Apparently, their welcome home balloons were an eyesore. People were furious, of course. I've never seen so many angry faces at our local diner. Everyone was talking about Karen and her so-called fines. She tried to fine me for my cat sitting in my front window. Mrs. Lee exclaimed over her usual plate of eggs and toast. Said it was unsightly wildlife. Mr. Thompson chimed in. She told me my American flag was hung improperly and demanded $100. Can you believe it? It didn't take long for folks to start complaining to the actual HOA. I was there at the emergency meeting they called. The community center was packed, every chair filled, people standing along the walls. The air was thick with tension, you could practically taste it. Our HOA president, Bob, looked like he'd aged 10 years in a week. "Folks, we understand your concerns," he began, his voice shaken slightly. "We want to assure you that Karen has no authority to issue fines or enforce rules. We're dealing with the situation." That's when Karen burst through the doors, face red as a tomato. "You're not dealing with anything," she shrieked. "This neighborhood is going to the dogs, and you're all too lazy to do anything about it." The room erupted. People were yelling, pointing fingers. I saw Mrs. Johnson, usually the sweetest lady you'd ever meet, stand up and shout, "You tried to fine me for my rose bushes, Karen. My prize-winning roses." Karen wasn't backing down. She marched right up to the front, turning to face the crowd. "None of you appreciate what I'm doing for this community. I'm maintaining our standards, our property values." Bob tried to interject. "Karen, please, this isn't..." But she talked right over him. "In fact, I think it's time for a change in leadership. I'm calling for an emergency election. It's clear this HOA board isn't fit to serve." The uproar that followed was like nothing I'd ever heard. People were on their feet, shouting over each other. I saw the Petersons, who'd lived here for 30 years, looking at each other like they couldn't believe what was happening. It took nearly an hour to calm everyone down enough to actually vote on Karen's proposal. When the results came in, it wasn't even close. Karen got exactly 2 votes, her own and, surprisingly, old Mr. Higgins, who later admitted he'd misunderstood the question due to his hearing aid being on the fritz. You'd think that would have been the end of it, right? But oh no, Karen was just getting started. The very next day, I was out checking my mail when I saw 3 police cars pull up in front of the Thompsons' house. My heart sank. I hurried over, along with half the neighborhood, to see what was going on. There was Karen, standing on the sidewalk, pointing accusingly at the Thompsons' front yard. "Officer, I want them arrested for vandalism and destruction of property." The poor cop looked confused. "Ma'am, what exactly is the problem here?" Karen's voice was shrill. "Look at that grass. They've clearly killed patches of it deliberately. It's a violation of our HOA rules and probably some kind of environmental crime." Mr. Thompson, still in his bathrobe, looked like he was about to explode. "It's called dry patches, Karen. It happens in the summer." I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The cops tried to explain to Karen that this wasn't a police matter, but she wasn't having it. She demanded to speak to their supervisor, then threatened to call the mayor. As the police were leaving, looking mighty annoyed, I heard one of them mutter, "Third call this week from this lady." Unbelievable, but Karen was just warming up. Over the next few weeks, it was like living in a war zone. She called the city on the lease for their backyard vegetable garden, claiming it was agricultural use in a residential zone. She reported the Garcias to child services because their baby was crying suspiciously loud. She even tried to get the fire department to cite Mr. Peterson for excessive smoke when he was having a barbecue. The whole neighborhood was on edge. People started avoiding their front yards, drawing their curtains. Kids weren't playing outside anymore. It was like all the joy had been sucked out of our little community. I remember sitting on my porch one evening, watching the sun go down and feeling a deep sadness. This wasn't the neighborhood I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. The friendly waves, the block parties, the sense of community, it was all gone, replaced by fear and suspicion. That's when I saw Mrs. Johnson shuffling down the sidewalk, looking nervous. I called out to her, "Everything okay, Mrs. J?" She hurried over, glancing over her shoulder. "Oh, it's terrible," she whispered. "Karen's on the warpath again. She's trying to get the city to force me to cut down my oak tree. Says it's a safety hazard." I felt a surge of anger. That oak tree was older than any of us, a neighborhood landmark. "She can't do that," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't so sure anymore. Mrs. Johnson's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to do. I can't afford a legal battle, but that tree. My late husband planted it when we first moved in." I put my arm around her shoulders, trying to comfort her, but inside, I was seething. This had gone on long enough. The next day, I decided to confront Karen directly. I marched up to her house, rehearsing what I was gonna say. But as I raised my hand to knock, I heard voices inside. Angry voices. "You promised me results." Karen was yelling. "I'm paying you good money to get these violations addressed." A man's voice responded, sounding exasperated. "Ms. Karen, I've told you, there's nothing illegal going on here. These are all normal, everyday activities. The police, the city, they're not going to take action because there's no cause for it." "Then what am I paying you for?" Karen screeched. "I want results. I want these rule breakers punished." I backed away from the door, my mind reeling. Karen had hired someone? To do what, exactly? As I hurried home, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get even worse. And boy, was I right. The very next morning, I woke up to find a notice taped to my front door. It looked official, with a city seal at the top. My heart was pounding as I read it. Notice of violation. Your property has been found in violation of City Code 147.3, B, excessive ornamental vegetation. You have 48 hours to remove all non-conforming plants or face fines of up to $1,000 per day. I couldn't believe my eyes. Excessive ornamental vegetation? My beloved flower beds that I'd tended for years? I looked up and down the street, seeing similar notices on every door. That's when I saw Karen, strutting down the sidewalk with a smug look on her face. She saw me standing there, notice in hand, and had the nerve to wave. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" she called out, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I do hope everyone's in compliance with city regulations. It would be such a shame if there were any consequences." I wanted to say something, to confront her, but I was too shocked. As she continued down the street, I saw my neighbors emerging from their houses, all holding identical notices, all wearing expressions of disbelief and anger. Mr. Peterson was the first to speak up. "This is ridiculous. They can't do this, can they?" Mrs. Lee joined in, her voice shaking. "My roses. My prize-winning roses. They want me to remove them?" One by one, people gathered in the street, comparing notices, voices rising in anger and confusion. I saw tears in Mrs. Johnson's eyes as she clutched her notice, no doubt thinking about her beloved oak tree. As the commotion grew, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A van was pulling up, the words, "City Code Enforcement," emblazoned on its side. Two official-looking men stepped out, clipboards in hand. Karen practically skipped over to them, a triumphant smile on her face. "Gentlemen, I'm so glad you're here. As you can see, this neighborhood is in dire need of your attention." One of the men, a tall fellow with a stern expression, addressed the crowd. "Good morning, citizens. We're here to follow up on multiple reports of code violations. We'll be conducting inspections of each property. Any violations found will result in fines and mandatory corrective action." The uproar that followed was deafening. People were shouting, demanding explanations, some even crying. I saw the Garcias huddled together, looking terrified. They were new immigrants, and I could only imagine what they were thinking. Through it all, Karen stood there, a smug smile on her face, watching the chaos unfold. And that's when something in me snapped. I stepped forward, my voice ringing out over the crowd. "Now hold on just a minute." I surprised myself with how steady I sounded. "This isn't right, and you all know it." I turned to the code enforcement officers. "Gentlemen, I don't know what you've been told, but I can assure you, there are no violations here. This woman," I pointed at Karen, who looked shocked that anyone would dare challenge her, "has been harassing this neighborhood for weeks. She's called the police, the fire department, even child services, all for imaginary violations." The officers looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable. The taller one spoke up, "Ma'am, we've received numerous complaints." I cut him off. "All from her, I'd bet. Have you actually seen any of these so-called violations? Or did you just take her word for it?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, her voice quavering but determined. "She tried to have my oak tree cut down. Said it was a hazard. That tree's been here longer than any of us." Mr. Peterson joined in. "She called the fire department on me for having a barbecue. Said it was excessive smoke." One by one, my neighbors spoke up, sharing their stories of Karen's harassment. The code enforcement officers listened, their expressions changing from stern to confused to downright embarrassed. Karen, seeing the tide turning against her, tried to interject. "They're all lying. This neighborhood is a cesspool of rule breakers and..." "That's enough, Karen." I surprised myself with the force in my voice. "We've all had enough. This stops now." I turned back to the officers. "Gentlemen, I think you can see what's really going on here. There are no code violations. There never were. Just a woman with too much time on her hands and a grudge against her neighbors." The officers huddled together, speaking in low voices. After a few moments, the taller one addressed us. "Folks, it seems there's been a misunderstanding. We'll need to review these complaints more thoroughly before taking any action. For now, consider these notices suspended." A cheer went up from the crowd. I saw relief wash over my neighbors' faces, replaced quickly by anger as they turned towards Karen. Karen, realizing she'd lost, started backing away. "You'll regret this," she sputtered. "I'll sue. I'll call the mayor. You'll do nothing," I interrupted. "Except leave us alone. Or next time, we'll be the ones calling the authorities. On you." With a final glare, Karen turned and ran back to her house, slamming the door behind her. As the code enforcement van drove away, my neighbors gathered around me, patting me on the back, thanking me. But I knew it wasn't over. Karen was still there, still our neighbor. The damage she'd done to our community wouldn't heal overnight. I looked around at the faces of my neighbors. Faces that had been etched with worry and fear for weeks, now showing the first glimmers of relief and hope. We had won this battle, but the war for the soul of our neighborhood was far from over. As everyone started to disperse, heading back to their homes, I couldn't help but wonder, what would Karen do next? And more importantly, how would we, as a community, stand against her? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain, we wouldn't let her destroy the neighborhood we all loved. Not without a fight.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.